mostly comments of various sorts, attempts to explore something. I'll try to explain what I'm thinking about, but I don't have an overarching theory about these things. And I think that much of what I've said, what I'm thinking of saying, has already been said here also. But I'm concerned with the way we are thrown into language as adults or past a certain point in childhood, where we indeed have a kind of identity between meta-language and language, in that the language that we have can refer to itself, and we can refer to our own thoughts, and we can discuss our own notions, and we can say anything we like, and so we can be quite inconsistent. And out of that comes, in the mathematical side or the scientific side, the desire to be consistent, and out of that comes the desire to have rules, and not only for consistency's sake, but for the sake of establishing certain domains in language that one wants to be able to use consistently, such as musical language and other examples of formalism, which are not necessarily coming from mathematics. And then there is the continual interrelationship between perception and articulation that goes on. And someone like Marguerite here has taken those themes and made art out of it, which can be interpreted in many, many different ways, as you well know, this example, and I won't comment on it very much further. But I do want to comment on this one a bit. What sort of language are you involved in here? You might say you're involved in geometrical mathematical language, because the abstract pieces of it, the articulated pieces of it, are indeed representing various geometrical forms. But you're involved in a perceptual display, and almost everyone who looks at this sees the triangle that isn't there. And so something has arisen, a gestalt has occurred that that isn't in the individual parts, and it has to do with the way you, if you try to explain it, then you will probably explain it in terms of the that is out there, and the perceiver, and properties of the perceiver, and how something got projected into the perception which is not actually there, and so on. And you get into a long and complicated conversation. And then the interesting thing about an example like this is that you can fall out of that whole theorizing back into your experience of it. And also, it becomes a scientific investigation, or an experimental investigation, after all. You don't have to stick with this one. You can change the angles, for example, and you may know what happens if you change the angles. If you made all these angles on the Pac-Man a little bit smaller, the triangle can become curved, and so on. So here there is this arena of language arising in relation to the language you have and in relation to your experience. And of course, it's always so. But I find it helpful to look at examples of this kind to think about that theme. So I say, we live in language that's identical to its own meta-language, and that we all know this in a certain sense, but we also know very little about it in some other sense. It's a basic cybernetic insight that marks the ability of the speaker of any human language to know that he or she can in that language comment on what is said in that language. It's a basic cybernetic term that allows communication and freedom of thought. The stance of freedom of language means that the speaker is responsible for all the distinctions that she makes. And the stance of freedom of language means that it is possible to formulate paradoxical structures. I can form directly a sentence like, this sentence is not true. And no one said I couldn't do it. It's grammatical, and it even makes a certain kind of sense. And one explores more deeply into these kinds of contradictory structures and finds things that are less obviously wrong, such as, I have a library and I wish to make another book and put it in the library, and that book shall list all the books in the library that do not list themselves in their own indices. And if you explore that, you find that there's some trouble about asking whether the book you're creating could list itself or not, as you know. And so it goes. And the stance of freedom of meta-language is what makes it possible to create formal languages that possibly are logically consistent. That is, when you get to the level of talking about formal languages, you are standing in the larger, less restricted language in which you can recognize that you have a formal language. You can recognize that the musical notation that you're using or even creating is following certain rules, and that you've made a formal language of it, and you can explain those rules to someone else, and we can learn to play music together and record music together by using that language, or similarly with mathematical languages. So there is no way to have the formal languages recognizable without having the informal language, the one where meta-language and language are conjoined. So it would seem. And yet, on the other hand, as I said, I'm wandering because I don't understand a lot of the questions I'm asking. On the other hand, if you look into a molecular biology, you seem to see formal language happening. At least in the way you observe it and describe it, you seem to see a formal language of the DNA and its interactions in 3 dimensions with the other molecules as a kind of formal language. And that formal language in your story has occurred prior to the emergence of language that can understand. And I just said the word understand, and of course, what I meant when I said that language and its meta-language are conjoined is that understanding is present. And without understanding being present, none of this would be making sense. But I don't know what understanding is either, but I value it. Now, by Gödel, we know that even if one does create a formal language that's logically consistent, if it's rich enough, it will admit a twist of meta-language embedded within it that makes it incomplete. And there's a story here that I want to slow down on. The story is the story of truth and provability for the mathematician. So we have to go back a little ways. For mathematicians, I'll speak in the mathematician's framework because it's easier to talk about truth there than truth in the wider metaphysical framework. But if you do go back far enough, most people believed that there was a notion of absolute truth or metaphysical truth. And certainly mathematicians like Euclid believed that they were writing down mathematical truths when they wrote down the axioms of Euclidean geometry. They were writing down truths. And then from these truths, other truths would be derived. And so truth and provability, there is the notion of provability in mathematics. You have isolated a system, and then within that system, you can march along certain lines from things that are given to you as truths to other truths. We all know that. But is truth the same as provability? Well, not in the old days, not in the Euclidean days. You started with truths, and then other truths came from them, and you were looking for the basic truths, maybe the one single truth out of which it would all come. So how did the question of truth being provability versus truth not being provability arise? It arose because mathematicians turned around at a certain point and said, well, we can't say that our axioms are true. We can only say that we have assumed them. And it came because, among other things, Euclid's axioms were seen not to necessarily be true. The crux of that comes around the time of Kant. Kant thought that Euclidean geometry was a priori, that it was truth in another sense, truth in the filter by which you see the world. But the mathematicians decided after a while that they were too confused by this notion of absolute truth, or the truth of mathematical propositions, which no longer seemed to necessarily be true of the world they had. And they decided that mathematics was about making certain assumptions, not necessarily true, and then the truths would be what came from deduction on the basis of those assumptions and the structure of the models. And so truth became provability for a while. What is true in mathematics is what is provable from whatever assumptions you have. So the Pythagorean theorem, for example, is not a truth of the world. It's a truth of Euclidean geometry, where one makes certain assumptions. Truth is provability, they thought for a while, until Gödel comes along and says, no, truth and provability are different. And how did it happen? I'm telling you a shaggy dog story here, and I hope it isn't confusing. But Gödel showed that truth and provability are different. And how could he do that? What truth could he point to that would not be provable? Where is this truth going to come from? There is no absolute truth outside the formal system for Gödel. There's only the formal system, except not quite. There's the formal system, the formal language, in relation to the understanding, the larger language in which the formal language is embedded. And Gödel was able to construct a truth that we could all agree upon in the relationship between the formal language and its observers, the mathematicians. And it was that truth that could not be proven inside the system. So that what you're seeing in the mathematical situation is not unlike this, what you're seeing over there in Klaus's chart on the right, where social theories are produced and those theories change the social structure. What Gödel did was he showed that if you produce and fix well enough a formal theory, then it will change the structure of what can be regarded as true, because certain relations arise between that formal theory and those who use it, and those become new mathematical truths that weren't known before and can't be achieved by the system. So that even in mathematics, the same social, but it's not strictly social structure, or rather, where does social structure begin is the question. Sorry, too many questions at once. But where does social structure begin? And social structure is always there because we're there and the speakers are there, and the speakers are making these formal systems, and those formal systems and their relationships to the speakers keep creating something new. So it's all of a piece. And the fascinating thing is to watch how these things are happening, whether they're happening in mathematics or in social systems or wherever they're happening. Thus, we're always thrown back to the basic cybernetic turn of language that is our birthright as human beings. And it means that the cybernetic discussion is truly inherent in any honest transdisciplinary study. The participant and her world are intertwined. One other comment. Here is sort of bare formalism, just a mark that's seen to make a distinction in the plane. But as soon as I said it is seen to make a distinction in the plane, I've gone beyond any objective notion of the mark. It is in the relationship of the observer to the mark that it is seen to make a distinction in the plane. And maybe you don't even see it as making a distinction in the plane, but we could talk about it. And the formal language made of that mark, we could make some formal language of it, is built from the mark. The language is inherently self-referential. The mark is seen to refer to its own distinction, but it's actually seen to refer to its own distinction in relation to whoever is observing it. So the mark stands for the distinction that is made by that mark. The distinction made by the mark is the distinction made by an observer. The mark and the observer are in that sense identical. That, of course, moves to metaphor. It's strictly speaking a metaphor, but perhaps a desirable one. I've already said what's here, that it should be pointed out that mathematics is another kind of languaging, letting an observer play with symbols, perhaps on paper, without herself seeming to appear on that paper. In the course of that play, the observer is involved and not separated from the actions in the seemingly separate world of the paper. And the meaning that this activity generates, the understanding that it generates, weaves a deeper world where the observer and her actions with the paper or other media are inseparable from herself. So that mathematical play or making up new symbols, making up language, maybe putting rules on them, maybe letting rules go, is all part and parcel of our speaking and needn't be regarded as something separate. And I'm just repeating myself with this last slide, that self-reference is natural in language and cannot be avoided. I'll stop there.
Questions? Jamie, you're muted.
James, there you go.
Yeah, I had seen Jerome's hand. I thought he was going to raise a question.
No.
So, yeah. So, Lou, I have to say, I always think of, I cannot help but make a comparison with the performance when I see your presentation. And I found it very interesting. I think it was Jerome who brought up Bertolt Brecht, and the way he used theater to put people in a completely different gestalt. And so when I listen to your presentations, I think you're performing George Spencer Brown, but that behind your performance, there is a real human being with all sorts of questions that you just don't tell us about. And for instance, you brought up Gödel, but you didn't bring up mathematical Platonism, and the way that I understand Gödel is kind of a very strong proponent of that. So actually, that is something I like to talk about. But then also the way you describe mathematicians as losing themselves in mathematics. And I think that's precisely what this whole thing of mathematical Platonism is all about. That not everyone loses itself in mathematics the way Gödel did, who has a reputation that he couldn't finish papers because he was so into finding the truth or something. and so that there are other ways of engaging with mathematics. And I think that you are actually also engaging in these other ways sometimes. So that's my question, how you think about mathematical Platonism and other ways of engaging with mathematics.
Yeah. uh, Let's see. We changed the screen. It might be easier on us if we didn't do screen sharing for the next slideshow until we're done with this discussion. Yeah. Right. That's a great point. Gödel was a Platonist, so while Gödel showed us that truth and provability are different, and showed the limitations of formal systems, he lived in the belief that there are absolute mathematical truths. That doesn't go away.
And I don't think that
I tend to be a relative Platonist myself. I don't know about absolute mathematical truth. I know that if you set a certain context out, like say the rules of the game of chess, then there are everything that happens in chess is determined by that, and similarly other situations. Mathematics itself being more interesting than one single game. But the question of whether there is an absolute mathematical truth is not one that I think is something that I want to believe in necessarily.
Lloyd,
thank you, Lou. Thank you.
Listening to you, I think you're taking very much a logic point of view. So there is, you asked then where is social structure stopping, where is cognitive structure, what are the limitations? But the whole notion of coupling is missing.
The whole notion of what?
Coupling.
Oh, coupling.
So,
Coupling.
and that creates,
In what sense missing? I realized that I might not have talked about coupling directly, but I was talking about it quite definitely in the sense of whenever a formal system is being worked with, it is coupled to some levels of understanding or observers or social system, that there's always this coupling, and that it is out of that coupling that the formal systems arise. Even the formal systems in biology must have arisen out of the coupling, if you were in that framework of molecular evolutions in the physical world.
the coupling makes it possible to do empirical projects. Well, you keep on the logical side, in a certain sense, avoiding
Avoiding what?
the coupling. That is an empirical question all the time.
I'm sorry, I didn't get the word. You said I'm avoiding
the coupling as an empirical question,
Oh, as an empirical question. Well, I was trying to address that with my stumbling about with hints about perceptual. For example, when you walk into the Kinesa illusion, it's a perceptual matter, and it leads you into a long and beautiful investigation, if you care to make it, as to how such things happen. And the same is true about any mathematics that ever arose, that it came from something empirical that someone was working with, measuring lengths, deforming things, counting, and so on, which arose, of course, from certain social situations. So there's always this long and remarkable story about how any given thing that we regard as under the objective investigation end of things came about. And it doesn't stick there because indeed of the coupling and the interactions. So if it sounds like I'm only being logical, it's probably true, but that I'm in that kind of an end of things, but I don't intend to over focus that way.
Thank you.
Jerome, and then Klaus.
Yes, thanks for this very fascinating talk, or rumination, or wandering, or whatever you called it, or whatever you considered. Just two very maybe basic, maybe even superficial reflections. On the one hand, I'm curious as to what use you might find in the philosophical direction of pragmatism as a tool, maybe to, or as a frame to in practice solve some of these quandaries as to truth and reality and whatnot. So that's the first question, comment point. The Wittgenstein, actually, you could consider the later Wittgenstein very pragmatically oriented, in the sense that this notion of you know what I mean. When there is a certain context, the other person, you understand what I mean, and there's no essential need to prove to the ultimate QED, some certain statement. So that's, again, it's another framing of the first comment. The second one, I was thinking as you were talking about, geometric and mathematical issues of the ancient Greeks, like Proclus and of course Euclid, and there's this discussion by Cornelius Castoriadis of what it was that caused the Greeks to advance so far in both philosophy, politics, even abstract mathematics. And he suggests that it's this basic notion of viewing nature, even social aspects of whatever social nature would be, as a self-created thing. He uses the term natura naturans versus natura naturata, the Greek, something that's pre-existing versus something that we sort of co-create. I guess that's the word of the week. So they investigated conic shapes, other things, very advanced. Was this an aspect? Would you say that this would be useful as an aspect of observing epistemologically, at least, how to advance to knowledge? At least observing maybe even other truths. Going to another culture and looking how they look at truth versus how we look at truth. So those are just sort of my abstract ramblings as to what you were saying. Sorry.
Yeah, certainly. You mentioned Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein's world line is a good illustration of some of the relationships between all of those different points of view. He starts by talking about a modeling and pictures and language as a picture of a reality. But it's a subtle discussion. It's not just mechanical picturing that he's talking about. But eventually he kind of gives up trying to talk that way and talks about language and meaning in terms of the way language is used. So it becomes much more pragmatic in the end. And he always took a very pragmatic point of view about mathematics, almost anti-theoretical. But I wouldn't try to discuss that. In terms of the evolution of people's ideas and what they do, I think it's really important for mathematics, particularly, that whatever you do, you should think about how it might actually be used somehow. Maybe it's going to be used as a metaphor. I like to think that mathematics can be used as a metaphor, that I can take a simple structure like a triangle and use it for talking about ideas. And everyone does this, right? But you don't always think about it. You may use a network, and then you have a network of networks, and you draw a picture like that, and it's a powerful metaphor. So mathematics as metaphor is something very pragmatic. But then mathematics as applied to studying something else is also a fantastic thing. Like studying long chain molecules is an aspect of applied topology, right? Long chain molecules are something we'd like to understand. How do they fold and so on? But if you have a long chain molecule, it is an open-ended gadget. And if we're thinking topologically, and you think of it in the abstract, well, a long chain object like this rope here and I put a knot in it, I have a problem. The knot can fall off the end, right? And I wanted to study the knot, but it fell off the end of the rope. So mathematicians jumped for a way to deal with that. And they said, well, we'll study only closed things like this, right? And they'll be deformable, but they're closed loop, right? And that was the tradition for a long time. But it doesn't speak to the pragmatics of dealing with long chain molecules. And you should do something else. And more recently, people have gotten loosened up a bit, and they've found ways to think about that. How do you think about something which isn't quite closed off, and the topology could disappear from it, but still it has some structure like that, and you'd like to understand it? So you need to look at it from many different points of view. As soon as you try to be pragmatic or have some hope of using something, then you are jostled into new forms of creation.
Klaus?
Thank you.
Well, I have a few comments. First, your second image of the triangles. That was interesting to me because it demonstrates with this, what I call the individual subjectivist notion. That means if we have a language like about triangles, and then we see things that way. If we don't have that language, we see things differently. And I think that's a good demonstration and we accept that what we see, because it's somehow there's some coherence between what we know, how we speak about things, and how we see things. And very often we are entrapped in our way of seeing, but that's another issue. One thing that interested me is the difference between provability and truth. Now, to me, provability has something to do with the hermeneutic view. That means you want to see whether something relates to something else, and that's provability, but it has nothing to do with truth. Now, I think my criticism starts when you say truth. Now, truth, you didn't define it. I mean, I think there is an important aspect of truth to, at least in the abstract objectivist notion of being representational. That means something is about something. We can prove it. It's raining. I'm going outside. Yes, indeed, it happens. That is the representational truth. But you seem to use the truth as being just generally acceptable. And that's the reason why I think you get confused between provability and truth. Provability, trying to search or find truth, I think that makes it very difficult to get into this. So this was a kind of just a comment. But what I'm totally unclear, and you should explain it to me at least, and I don't know whether everyone else is, when you say that that we live in language which includes its own meta language, and it is obvious, or it is, how is it obvious? For me, it's not. Can you
okay, so there are two main questions. Let me deal with the first one first. You talk about truth and provability, and you said you take truth to mean, you said that I seem to take truth to mean acceptable or obvious, but when I spoke of truth for mathematicians, I meant that it is true about a situation that everyone would agree upon. For example, it is true that if I have a standard deck of cards, then there are 4 aces. Right? That's a truth about the deck of cards.
Yeah, but here
it isn't one. It isn't
object.
one. I'm sorry. It isn't one that we had to deduce from axioms. It's just true about those cards that there are 4 aces in a standard deck, right? So we have lots of truths of that kind, and then we have truths like the Pythagorean theorem is true. And no one thinks of that as something which is just out on the table and observable, although you can measure triangles. What you want to do is to become convinced of how it comes about that the square on the hypotenuse is of the same area as the sum of the squares on the sides. And then someone comes along and points out to you some nice construction, like if you drop a perpendicular here and slice the hypotenuse square into two rectangles, one of them is the square on one side and one is the square on the other, and we get an explanation. So we're looking for an explanation, and then we say, oh, yes, so it's true, through an explanation and an understanding of a situation. So I just am thinking of truth in those two ways of talking.
Well, you think truth is for you acceptability.
Acceptability.
Yes.
Evidentiality. No, evidentiality would be a better word, I think.
Okay.
But
right,
I mean,
it's different from the representational notion of truth.
What do you mean by that? What do you
the-
mean by the representational notion?
When I say it's raining, I can go outside and find out.
Oh, but that's
When-
evidential. Right.
Yes, you can call it evidential, but evidential means there must be something outside language that you compare with it, that you refer to.
Suppose I
the whole
said
notion of reference is always about something.
sure.
In fact, I didn't make an important point. Whenever we talk about things, we talk not about language. We talk about things outside language, and that's where representational truth comes in. But I wish that that's the reason why I make the distinction. For example, common sense or coherence. These are other criteria than representation.
Well, let's go back to my deck of cards. If I said to you there are 4 aces in this deck, well, and I hand you the deck, you can check that my statement is true, right? You can riffle through the cards and check that it's true.
If I have the cards.
It's actual. I give you a deck of cards, right?
Okay,
or I could say to you, this is a standard deck of cards, believe me. And then you could say to me, then there are 4 aces in your deck. And that would be true on the basis of my proposition that it was a standard deck. Yeah.
Yeah, but you talk about a standard deck that is in front of us. Yes, you can predict something. I mean,
but I could say to you,
that's still a truth function.
If I had, but I can vary this. So I could say, if I had a standard deck of cards, then there would be 4 aces in it, and that's a deductive truth from the definition.
Yeah.
And they're related to one another because you may actually have the actuality of it that you can check. Or you may not. Right. And the Gödelian rising of that truth is he needs to construct the deck of cards, the formal system, and then the truth that is not provable arises from the construction. It's in the interrelationship of the observer and the system. Right.
Lou, Klaus had a second question.
But wait. There was Klaus's other question, right? Which was a more important question. But let's transit between them with a statement. I say this statement has 33 letters. I don't remember whether that's true or not, but you could check. It's either true or false, right? Because it's a self-referential statement. So all I'm saying is about language reference is that language that we live in, the language that we got to by the age of 7 probably, can refer to lots of things in our worlds. It can refer to lamps and people and emotions, and it can even refer to itself. I can talk about my own words. My words can refer to my words. And this is, everyone will assent to this, I think, but how it goes on and how we understand how it goes on is not obvious to me. So when I say we all know this, we all know about it. We all know how to do it, just as I know how to form a sentence in the air and end it. But while I know some English grammar, I can't say that I know what I'm doing when I'm speaking to create a sentence that ends. So when you're living in language, we do many things that we can observe and seem to understand. And we do understand that we have our own, that we understand that the language can refer to itself, that we can refer to ourselves, but we don't fully understand it. So I'm saying yes and no. I understand, I don't understand. It's obvious, it's not obvious.
If I may say, I think the fundamental thing is that you say the language refers. I would say it doesn't. You use the language.
I agree with you.
That's a very important difference.
No, I agree with you completely. It's a further saying to say that this sentence, I write a sentence like this sentence has 33 letters. It does not refer to itself. It only refers to itself through the medium of a person being there understanding it.
Yeah, well,
just as the mark I drew in my slide doesn't make a distinction.
Yeah, but
the
you
mark
say, in
makes
fact, literally, the mark makes the distinction on the paper.
Right, but that's one of your metaphors, like you were talking about, right?
Yes.
It's a metaphor. It's a condensed way of speaking as well. And of course, we confuse ourselves with that condensed way of speaking.
And confused that this it's a question of the habit of talking in these terms. Yeah. And I think one has to differentiate these habits, cultural coherence issues, differentiate that from representational notions of truth. And I don't want to confuse all of them under the name of truth.
Sure, right. So that's my point in a certain sense, that you want to start from where you are, but where you are has a lot of clarity and a lot of condensations as well, and you want to observe the condensations as much as possible in order to articulate more. But it's important to start from